All right, everyone. First and foremost, I'd like to thank PSA, this amazing organization, and their hard work for putting this amazing conference together. It's great to be among the several speakers, and today I'll present a work in progress on the topic of measurement and meta-science. And that it's funny just because of the Facebook meta thing, but anyways, that I hope to deep dive into the measurement practices of ideology, as well as the consequences for theory on it. So this work couldn't be possible without Gilles Balesta, so a shout out for my star collaborator. And before I start, I just want to point out that there will be a hackathon tomorrow on replications and reversals in social sciences by the FOR community. I hope you can attend that talk as well. All right, let's start with measuring ideology. So the organization is presented as follows. We'll first have the briefest introduction to the study of ideology, and then address the motivation for this research and provide a summary of the presentation so you know from the get-go where we're heading towards, right? So the presentation, then we'll go over the presentation principal claim. We'll talk about the systematic review of the literature we conducted, as well as the empirical study to show our findings. And finally, we'll talk about some solutions and approaches we can find to make our science more cumulative. All right, so here's the introduction. So it is the briefest. So ideology is measured on numerous disciplines, ranging from social sciences to humanities. It is used as a dependent variable in quantitative science, a predictor covariate, and also to enroll participants on studies. And there's three main approaches to the study of ideology, broadly speaking. The first focus on the etiology of ideology, which is just the ideational content of it. Think of the analytical study of conservatism. What does it mean? What does it relate to? What are its principles? But that goes for liberalism, anarchism, and other ideologies. The second, the discursive approach, focuses on the mediums through which ideology is expressed. Think of political elites discourse, the communicative practices, cultural symbolisms, imagery, and so forth. And the third, and the topic of this research, focuses on the ideological phenomena at the individual level. So taken as known by their bearers, us, right? And within this field, there is a symbolic ideology. There's two major facets: symbolic ideology, which has to do with your identity. It's tied to your sense of self, as well as the operational ideology, which just means policy preferences. So think of your positions on whether abortion should be legalized or whether drugs should be legalized. Those are social issues, and economic issues is the government should interfere in the economy, or we should have a market, a free market kind of economical arrangement, and so forth. All right, so given this brief introduction, I hope to have conveyed how important ideology is for the study of social sciences. And our main question is how the researchers studying ideology are measuring this construct. What are the specific practices? And to our knowledge, there's no specific study that does this. So we try to address it by conducting a systematic literature review of more than 400 articles that have already been published in social sciences. So our research, which I'll show you in a second, has four major findings. So the first one is that the measurement of ideology has a lot of heterogeneity. So we're measuring very differently from one another. The second is that the content of the scales measuring, or instruments of measuring ideology, think of the single items, right? The measure LGBT rights, immigration, welfare state, healthcare. They vary a lot, and they tend to overlap so little that really begs the question whether we are measuring the same construct. And third, even when we're using the same ideological measure, so when we're using, for example, the most common measure, which is Wilson and Patterson scale, or another, we are using it very differently. We're modifying it with the scale points, the labels, how it's coded, and so forth. And fourth, and perhaps most importantly, when using different scales with the same people to test the comparability and interchangeability of these scales on theories that are well established in political science and political psychology, we do find different results, meaning that if you use one scale versus another, you may have, of the same construct, you may find different results, which is very not great. So given the substantial heterogeneity of the scales and how little they overlap, this is our main principal claim, all right? That findings in political behavior and the psychology of political behavior in mostly political science, social and political psychology, but also in sociology, economics, and so on, as well as the perseverance or the continuance of long-standing debates. Think of whether we are polarized or not, whether ideology is pervasive or not among the public, whether there are ideological asymmetries, sort of psychological differences between those who endorse, say, conservatism versus liberalism, whether social and economic conservatism are different paths towards higher endorsement of ideology. So all these debates are at least in part influenced by the idiosyncratic selection of measures and the poor measurement practices in general. So basically what we're trying to say is that there's a lot of noise in the literature caused by these measures that contribute to the continuance of these debates. All right, so what is the principle, what is the status quo now? What is the routine practice? So the routine practice is to measure ideology with one instrument, and which vary widely from one another, but we draw conclusions about ideology in general, and we do so relying on the assumption that the measures are interchangeable. So if I use one or the other, the results of my study is about ideology regardless of the measure. So they are untied. And the question that is necessary to ask is, does it matter if I'm using one scale over another? So it matters if this assumption, which is untested so far, this assumption of interchangeability, does not hold. If swapping one ideological instrument for another yields a different conclusion, this poses a serious problem to the comparability of existing findings. It poses a problem to the robustness and replicability of findings as well, and altogether the generalizability of findings. So all of this impact our ability to accumulate knowledge and move our science forward. So depending on the results that I'll show you, or depending on the variability and heterogeneity that we will find in this presentation, we can pretty much adjudicate the extent to which these long-standing debates or the literature itself may suffer from noise ensuing from these different measures. So what are the two predictions of our study? The first one is that there's high heterogeneity in ideological instruments, there's high heterogeneity in content, as well as measurement practices. And our second study is that our second prediction is that substantive findings will change as a function of the ideological measure you use. All right, so of course, one regards the literature. So we dove into the literature and conducted a systematic review, and the other relates to data and empirical data, survey data, and we conducted a study, an empirical assessment of this as well. All right, so how did we go about the study? Number one, we decided a priori what be the indicators of the heterogeneity, and what would classify as indicators of heterogeneity, what would classify as indicators of quality, so that is to say incomplete reporting, technique, dimensionality, so forth, or the lack of. And also we define the scope of our study, which is just operational ideology. And just to be clear, ideology is measured in many different ways. We're looking at one type only, which is operational ideology, which is by far the most common. And we are conducting studies on the other ones, and we can already tell you it's even worse. So just letting you know. What are the variables that we collected? So for each article that we reviewed, we collected meta information, sample specifics, study specifics, measurement specifics, and information about construct validation. So we have a database that has all these columns encoded for each of the articles. So the method by which we used is called forward and backward search literature, and you can find the citations there. And we started with 7 scales, which are sort of representative of the field in terms of scales that are used. And from these, we forward search. That is to say, we looked at the papers that cite these scales, and we found 258, as well as backward search, which means that we look over the papers that these 7 scales cite themselves. And we identified a total of 394, and after a selection, basically because articles do not measure ideology, or they're not accessible, or only symbolic ideology, or RWA and SDO, we get to a final sample of 207. So we coded fully 207 articles, and I would ask you to think how many unique measures we found in 207 articles. So just think a little bit about, like, what kind of number would you expect? Would you expect 10%? Is that a lot? 20%? And so forth. So have that in your mind, and here's the result. In 207 coded papers, we found 152 unique and distinct measures. That is over 75% of all measures. And on the right, you see a graphical depiction of these scales, and the size of the sliver represents how many times they were measured. So I'm going to use here the pointer to show you that the most used scale is the Wilson and Patterson scale, or C scale, is used a lot more than other scales. And the second one is unnamed, so people don't name their scales. That's a common practice. So we found 43 of these unnamed scales, and the most prevalent is Wilson and Patterson with 49, and followed by Cultural and Economic Conservatism by De Vitti, which is a European scholar in Flanders, in Belgium. All right, so here are some trends. So we're asking ourselves to what extent this is a problem for the future, and we do find a growing pattern. It isn't as exponential as this curve seems to point out, but it is still growing. And another question that you may have is whether or not the scales are being published in, I don't know, predatory journals, or journals that are not representative of good psychological or political science. But indeed, they are published in top journals. So in psychology, PID, but we do have political psychology, a journal of personality and social psychology, personality and social psychology bulletin. So these are mainstream journals. And in political science, we do have journal GOP, the Forum, American Political Science Review, which is the flagship, as well as American Journal of Political Science. So we are talking about these scales are published at our main outlets. When looking at the share per specific field, what we're looking at here is a high percentage in psychology for these scales. rather than political science, but we are reviewing our code, and we'd like to say that perhaps these numbers will change a little bit. We're also adding some articles that were sent to us in the first time that we presented it, so we're including a few more soon, so this proportion might change. In any case, psychology would certainly have a lot more scales. And then we move on to content analysis part of our scale. That is to say, we move away from how we're measuring it or how many do we have, and we go, we focus on what is the content of each item of the scale. How much does the content between scale items overlap with each other? Because if the items are similar, if they have similar face validity, perhaps they are measuring and tapping into the same construct, right? So for this, we added to our 7 scales, we added DeVita, Lehman, and Carson and Sedenius, based on the fact that they are very frequent and well-cited scales, and we did a content analysis for these scales, of these 10 scales. And here you have these 10 scales, they amount to 202 items together, and we found 60 topics that are unique while using a somewhat conservative approach to form categories. We follow Eiko Fried's work to do this content overlap analysis, and you will see by this graph that this is very much Eiko Fried's work. In any case, in the table we show a Jacquard Index that is statistics used to evaluate similarities between sample sets, and it ranges from 0 to 1. 1 means total overlap, and 0 means 0 or no overlap. So the results here really indicate low, very low overlap, and the Jacquard Index is, the average is 0.1. So this means that the scales really tend to share very little content between themselves. So even at the item level, there's little to be hopeful about the extent to which they measure the same construct. And here is just a visual depiction of what I'm talking about. And you can see here, for example, topic number 1, the topic most frequent is the topic of abortion in these 10 scales. And it has a frequency of 9, meaning that 9 scales do touch upon abortion. So that means a content overlap of 90, for example. The second one is T40, which is here, and LGBT rights, which is present in 6 categories, right? So you can follow along all the other topics, and you can see that after just a few topics, it gets very varied, meaning that the topic isn't repeated across scales at all. All right. So the last part, or the third point that I mentioned in the beginning, is that even when you're using the same scale, we are changing the original work so much in our own studies that it is really doubtful that we can consider the same scale. So in the case of the C scale, the Wilson and Patterson scale, this is how many times it got published in the literature. This is the sciences journals in which it was published. This is just in case that it was a modification or some sort of adaptation. And now we go back to the items. So people reported using the C scale with 13 items all the way to 67. And bear in mind that the original one is 50. And the original one also is supposed to be scored yes, no, and a middle point, like a sort of like a 3 points. It's supposed to be measured with a yes, no scoring, and a question mark here at the bottom. And note that it's not even the most frequent way that this is used. And when it comes to scoring the final score for somebody else's, somebody's final, say, the score that is used for inference, this has been done with binomial, mean, non-disclosed, and sum. So it can differ a lot from one another. All right, so moving on to a review of this study, we found that out of the 207 scales, 152 were unique measures. There's very little content overlap. There's high substantial heterogeneity even within the most used scales, and items vary a lot in content, issue representativeness, format, number, etc., dimensionality. And there's very little validation evidence. So this part I sort of skipped because of time, but we showed that there's very little reporting of validation. And this poses a problem to the comparability and generalizability of our findings, which bears onto our ability to accumulate knowledge. All right, but social scientists would say, fine, we haven't been doing this in the best way possible. And it is, of course, very likely that there is heterogeneity across time and space between these scales, especially on the international arena. But we do find the same patterns within countries. But in any case, does it matter for inference, right? So that's the question, does it matter practically? If we use an ideological measure of your own, or if you create it, are you perhaps influencing your findings by not using another or not creating two measures, for example, or serving two measures? So to answer this question, what we're basically asking is, are ideological instruments interchangeable, right? So we want to investigate the comparability of ideological measures. Are they equally good indicators of ideology? Do they present equally desirable validity properties? Can they be used interchangeably to arrive at the same results? And more globally, of course, if we conduct research using one instrument, can we draw conclusions about the nature of ideology in general? So for this, we conducted a nationally representative sample, and we have a replication sample as well in the United States with following the census. We control for carelessness, consistency checks, time checks, just to make sure that the quality of data was upstanding. And we also had successful replications in 2018 and 20 of these results. But basically, we surveyed 5 ideological scales. So we gave these scales to the same people, as well as their auxiliary variables to test established theories. And basically, we test 4 theories. We did test 8 in the end, by the way, and they all show the same results, but I'll just show you 3 of them here. So the first claim is from political science, and it says that Americans are symbolically conservative and operationally liberal. So let me break it down. Symbolically conservative is what you answer on your identity question. So how liberal are you from, where would you place yourself in this continuum? And the labels are very liberal to very conservative. For example, there's many ways to ask this question, but it's tied to your sense of identity. And the other operationally ideology is about policy preferences. And it's a well-established finding in the literature, particularly in political science, that when you ask people how they feel, what they are, most Americans say, I'm moderate or conservative. So that's more or less what this distribution is showing. So they do not see themselves as liberal. There's many studies on why this is very interesting. But when you ask them policy preferences, so how much do you agree with LGBT rights, equal rights for women, equal rights for minorities, and so forth, they do tend to endorse more liberal positions. So that's why the claim is Americans are symbolically conservative and operationally liberal. All right, great. So what do we find? So we do replicate this finding with one scale, and we find that symbolically conservative, so using a symbolic conservatism measure, we find that if Americans are more conservative in a nationally representative sample, and using one operational ideology, they are more liberal, all right? However, using another scale, this gets flipped completely. And using another scale, what you would find is the very opposite of this result, which characterizes a reversal, right? And a reversal is when, in the context of a replication, you find the opposite expected effect. And if you look at all the results here, you will see that, well, there's one scale that would yield a reversal. There's two scales that confirm the findings, which is Bernstein and Feldman and Johnston. And there's two scales, Hennigan, as well as Zimbar, Pizarro, and Bloom, that would yield a no result, right? So this is not great. The second case, moving on to the second case, it's about polarization, whether Americans are yet or not polarized. And the claim by Locus, 2016, at POQ, the Journal of Political Science, is that Americans are not yet polarized, but there is a trend towards polarization, right? And what they expect, however, and this is particularly interesting for psychologists, so you see like the amount of evidence that is necessary for an inference on this topic, is that low polarization, it's a Hedges G, which is like the standardized Cohen's D of 0.52, which is already a very high effect size. Moderate polarization, we're talking about a Hedges D of 2.4 between two groups distribution, and a high polarization starts at 3.9 Hedges D, which is almost unheard of, right? So the weight of the evidence necessary to call we are polarized is absurd in political science, if you ask me. In any case, those are the standards using this paper, and our goal isn't to dispute these claims, but to test it as it was tested before, meaning that if we use different ideological scales, would we find different results? All right. So as expected, yes, we would. And here, for Feldman and Johnston, we would have a significant p-value. For Zimbar, Pizarro, and Blue, and Bernstein, we also, in purple, we would find a significant result, meaning that distributions do yield, in using the characteristics used by Locus 2016, they would yield a significant p-value and therefore a polarized result, which is contrary in a reversal to the claim by Locus 2016. All right, this is the final claim that I'll present, is that ideology predicts distrust in climate change far and above other variables. But the most interesting aspect of this study is that we use a multiverse analysis. So we run every possible model among 15 predictors of distrust in climate change. And we put in the 5 ideological scales to compete for prediction. And what is interesting is that there's 2 scales that are always, so this is a probability of 1 to be a significant predictor in the model. And you have 3 scales who are here close to the 0. That means that depending on which variables are in the model, they are significant predictors or not, right? So it's measurement dependency. So what this analysis shows is basically, yes, it absolutely depends on each measure you're using for conservatism to predict, to assert about the claim that ideology predicts distrust in climate change. All right, so I will skip this one, but basically we find the same results. And the summary is, we have been conducting research in ideology as if we're using all in the same measure, a single predefined, well-tested, cross-nationally validated measure. Of course, this doesn't exist, but as if. So we currently do research as if we're all using a standardized golden standard measure, right? So it's not that we could arrive at this measure. Perhaps we could get a really good measure, but this is more in the metaphysical world, I would guess. But we are not, and this is showed by the empirical study. So these results sort of lead to the conclusion that the idiosyncratic use of a particular scale poses a threat to the replicability and generalizability of ideological research. and that's a problem for cumulative sciences. So the main takeaway is that these characteristics, the main sort of implications is that these characteristics have been associated with an increased risk to failure to replicate. Research in ideology is riddled with jingle-jangle fallacies, and altogether we speculate that it's very unlikely that these measures are equally good indicators of ideology, that they are valid in any sense, and that they can be used interchangeably. So an important implication is that this conceptual and measurement problem, which has pervaded research in ideology, do have implications for ideological thinking. So if the basic measurement of ideology is flawed, it is likely that insights from this research, for example, whether or not people are ideological or they hold ideological beliefs, cannot be trusted. So without reliable measures or reliable measurement, the level of ideological thinking in the public is widely underestimated right now, and the relationships between ideology and other important variables may appear to be less complicated than they actually are. All right, so we have just 3 recommendations and we would end the presentation. So we argue that there is there should be a push for institutional efforts towards standardized measurement. That is not a whole solution, but it would help to have a scale, the properties of a scale to be known and publicly known, and that we developed or institutions develop ideological scales that are invariant or that have properties that are invariant, dare I say, in time, right? For example, another solution is to have a theory-based measurement of ideology. And of course, this theory will need to explain its boundary conditions. We can also qualify findings from now on rather than talk about ideology, but use specific topics. So, for example, LGBT rights, abortion, free market, and so on. And we can also use methods. So we could more carefully develop and report instruments' validity properties. So it's perhaps already there. There is a scale that it's very good, but we don't know among all the scales that exist. And we can always use test equating models, it's an IRT-based technique in which you can compare scales from one another. That's it. We do have a question of our own. So if you're watching this recording later, or members of the audience have any thoughts on these questions, so theories about testing, what instruments you want highlighted, how do we solve this problem, please send us an email. Go Team Science, we're very open to your feedback as well as joining our project. That's it. Thank you so much. And a big thank you to Delia Balesta and our student assistants, Jacquard Smith and Michelle Daniela Sprintz.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I don't know about everyone else, but that was a brilliant presentation for me. I'm going to open it up to questions, suggestions, and general thoughts.
I'm also fine if Sandra starts presenting and then we do Q&A after. What do you think, Sandra?
Both would be fine for me. Yeah, I don't mind. If there are no urgent questions, I can also go ahead.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Is everyone okay with that? Okay. All right. All right. Then, yeah, Sandra, please go ahead.
Okay. Do you first want to introduce me again, or should I just introduce? Okay.
I've got your picture here. Yes. Okay. Here we are. A quick introduction to Sandra. Sandra, could you help me out with your last name? How do I pronounce it correctly?
Geiger. yeah,
Geiger.
no one ever knows. So outside of Germany.
Okay, so we definitely welcome you, Sandra, who is a PhD student at the University of Vienna and part of the junior research program. And I'm very excited to hear what you have to say about a topic that I rarely ever see at PSACON. So I'm glad that you're here, and I look forward to your presentation on how we look at spillover effects for within environmental science. So please go ahead.
Yes, thank you for your introduction, and also, yeah, thanks for being here so early. And yeah, I'm really happy to be able to present today. And I'm going to present our work on a Bayesian meta-analysis on environmental spillover effects, and that has been conducted together with 4 really great collaborators: Cameron Brick, Ladislas Nalborczyk, Anna Bossard, and Nils Jostman. So first of all, I would quickly like to explain what spillover effects are. So let's imagine that an intervention is introduced in a city. So for example, public transportation is made freely accessible. And this intervention most of the time has direct effects. So most of the psychological studies also look at, okay, how does this intervention change the target intention or behavior? So in this case, commuting. However, yeah, most of the time people don't really look at indirect effects. So which effects does the intervention have on non-targeted intentions and behaviors? For example, in this case, it could be recycling or any other pro-environmental intention or behavior. And these indirect effects on non-targeted intentions and behaviors, those are the so-called spillover effects. And spillover effects can, on the one hand, be positive. That means the intervention increases commuting, so the direct effect, and also increases non-targeted intentions and behaviors. Spillover effects can also be negative. That means the intervention increases the target intention or behavior, so commuting, but decreases recycling. And of course, there's also the possibility that the intervention is effective in terms of the direct effect, but does not really affect any non-targeted intentions or behaviors. And I mean, in psychology, that makes especially sense because a lot of the direct effects are already quite small. So it would also make sense that there's actually no effect on non-targeted intentions or behaviors. Okay, so for the meta-analysis, the first aim was to update a previous meta-analysis by Maki et al. And generally to integrate the experimental and quasi-experimental research on spillover effects of intervention on pro-environmental intentions and behaviors. And the second goal was a little bit to identify characteristics of interventions that may be associated with more positive spillover. So for example, we looked at autonomy support, so whether the intervention supports autonomy with regards to the first behavior. We looked at whether the intervention provides a rationale to engage in the first behavior. So in our example, this was commuting. We looked at whether the intervention implemented any financial disincentives or incentives with regards to the first behavior. And we also looked at different goals based on goal framing theory. So in general, there are 2 goals. Either the intervention can address normative goals, which would be, in our case, just appealing to what's morally right. So environmental protection, for example, it can be like, okay, take the bus, save the environment. That would be a normative goal. Or on the other hand, a campaign could also emphasize personal gain goals. That would, for example, be take the bus to save money. And our last aim was to investigate generalizability and to look a little bit into whether spillover effects are similar across different research settings and also across different sample types. Okay, so regarding the meta-analytic criteria, we only included studies that had an intervention that effectively targeted a pro-environmental intention or behavior, or that primed participants with past behaviors. And we also only included studies if this intervention was compared to a control condition with no intervention, or to a comparator condition with an alternative intervention. And of course, the studies also needed to measure spillover effects to either non-targeted intentions or self-reported or objective behaviors. And all of these studies needed to be either experimental, quasi-experimental, or natural experiments. And then we also had a few additional criteria which are not that important, but I think it's important to know that we also included unpublished empirical articles, citations as well, and a thesis. And yeah, of course, we could only include the studies if the statistical information was available online, or 1 month after we requested it from the authors. For the meta-analysis, we in total searched for databases. That was PsycInfo, Greenfile, Business Source Premier, and the Social Science Citation Index. And we also did some more unsystematic searches on Google Scholar. We scoped reference lists of relevant articles, the Open Science Framework, and also, of course, contacted authors in the field. And these searches then led, after all screenings, all the exclusions, etc., resulted in 29 articles, 38 studies, and 63 aggregated effect sizes, or 183 non-aggregated effect sizes. Okay, before I go directly into the results, I would first like to, because it's a Bayesian meta-analysis, I would quickly like to explain the main idea behind Bayesian analysis, so that you can actually understand the results for those of you who are not familiar with Bayesian analysis. So in general, for Bayesian analysis, before we see the data, we specify our prior knowledge. So for example, here you see the prior distribution for what we expected for the overall effect size. So for the overall effect size in terms of Cohen's d, we sort of expected, okay, most effect sizes will lie between -2 and 2, and beyond that, it's quite unlikely. So for meta-analyses in terms of Cohen's d, that makes a lot of sense. And then during the analysis, those prior distribution or this prior knowledge is updated with the actual data, which then results in the posterior distributions. And those posterior distributions you will also see a lot later in the results section. So one possibility is that there's no spillover, which you can see here. So that basically means the posterior distribution is centered around 0. And what also often happens is that, of course, because more data come in, the posterior distribution is most likely to be more narrower than the prior distribution, because of course with more data we can be more certain where the actual effect size lies. There's also the possibility that there's positive spillover. That means that the posterior distribution would shift a little bit to the right in the positive area. And there's also the possibility that there's negative spillover, which is exactly the opposite of positive spillover, so that the posterior distribution would shift more to the left compared to the prior distribution in the negative area. And our conclusions about the hypothesis were based on those posterior distributions as well as the Bayes factor. And for Bayesian analysis, you can basically get support for the null hypothesis, that there's no spillover effect, but you can also get support for the alternative hypothesis, that spillover effects are different from 0, either positive or negative. And to give you a little bit of a feeling what the Bayes factor means, I brought this slide today. So basically, if you later on see in the results sections Bayes factors between 1 and 3, you can't really draw any conclusion based on that because the evidence is just not strong enough. However, if you then see Bayes factors of 3 to 10, that already looks a little bit better. That means moderate evidence, either in support of the null hypothesis or the alternative hypothesis. And between 10 and 30 would be strong support. Between 30 and 100, very strong support, and above 100, extreme support. So just as a general guideline on how we could or how we can interpret those numbers. Okay, I hope you're already a bit curious about the results. So first of all, we looked at the overall spillover effect on intentions and behaviors separately. What we found was that there was weak evidence for the null hypothesis that there's no or a zero spillover effect on intentions with a Bayes factor of 2.32. And as I've said, that's quite weak support, and we can't necessarily conclude a lot from that. And how weak the support is, you can also see in this pizza plot or pie chart to the right. So this basically means here we have around 70%, or there's a 70% chance that these data arise under the assumption that spillover effects are zero. But there's also still a 30% chance that those data rise under the assumption that spillover effects are non-zero. So yeah, here we don't really know yet. For behaviors, that looked a little bit different. So for behaviors, we found strong evidence for the null hypothesis that there's no spillover effect on behaviors with a Bayes factor of 15.44. And here you can also see that there's a 94, I think around 94% chance that those data rise under the assumption that spillover effects are non-zero. And the chance for the alternative hypothesis that it's non-zero is only very small, so around 6% here. Okay, that already sounds a little bit depressing, but of course, we didn't really find overall spillover effects, but that doesn't necessarily mean that, that there can still be moderators that there can still be factors that moderate the effect. So under some or with some interventions, spillover effects could be still more positive compared to other interventions. So as I said earlier, we looked at whether the interventions were autonomy supportive or controlling. And here we found that autonomy supportive interventions, for example, providing information or autonomy supportive framing, education, were associated with more positive spillover. So you can see that here, that's the blue curve compared to the controlling interventions. That's the orange curve. And here we actually found very strong evidence. Secondly, we also looked at whether interventions that provide a rationale for engaging in the first behavior are associated with more positive spillover. And here we split up the analysis into intentions and behaviors because we had enough effect sizes to do that. And here we found sort of moderate evidence that providing a rationale is associated with more positive spillover. So that's once again the blue curve compared to providing no rationale. And a similar result was found for behaviors here with strong evidence. So once again, the blue curve is more to the right. So is associated, providing a rationale is associated with more positive spillover compared to providing no rationale. Then we also looked at financial disincentives and once again split up the analysis into intentions and behaviors. And here we found, as expected, that providing no incentives or no disincentives is associated with more positive spillover, so the blue curve here, compared to interventions that use financial disincentives or incentives, the orange curve. And that was also supported with strong evidence. For behavior, this pattern looked a little bit differently. Here we only found weak evidence that actually no disincentives were associated with more positive spillover. And that you can actually also nicely see in the picture below, because the two posterior distributions, the one for financial disincentives and no financial disincentives, overlap by a lot. We, for the last intervention characteristic, we also looked at the goal the intervention emphasized. So we first looked at whether normative goals, so for example, the emphasizing environmental protection, is associated with more positive spillover compared to emphasizing personal gain goals, so for example, health benefits or personal financial benefits. And here you can see that normative goals is the orange curve and personal gain goals is the blue curve. And we found extreme evidence that normative goals are associated with more positive spillover compared to personal gain goals. And we also looked at combining both types of goals, because some interventions address both goals. And here we found, actually contrary to our hypothesis, that both types of goal are associated with the most positive spillover. And for some exploratory analyses, we also generally looked at whether spillover effects are similar or different across different research settings. So we looked at laboratory, online, and field studies. And we found that in general, there was moderate to strong evidence that spillover effects seem to generalize, or the magnitude of spillover effects seem to be similar across different research settings. However, here on the right from the posterior distributions, you can also see that for laboratory studies, spillover may actually be a little bit smaller compared to field and online studies. And very lastly, we looked at the sample. We looked at spillover effects in student versus non-student, non-university student samples. Once again, split it up for intentions and behaviors. And basically for intentions, we found moderate evidence that spillover effects across these different types of samples are similar, which you can nicely see from the posterior distribution here as well. So those distributions once again overlap quite a lot. However, for behaviors, the story was a little bit different. So for now, we still found weak evidence for no difference between those two groups in terms of spillover effects. However, if you look at the posterior distributions there, you can actually see that effects for non-students seem to be larger. So their researchers also need to be a little bit cautious, because maybe if we use non-student samples, or sorry, if we use student samples, that may actually underestimate the effect. Okay, and then we also looked at publication bias, and what you can see from this contour enhanced funnel plot is so the inner white triangle are the p-values above 0.05, and actually most of the findings, or most of the effects, were non-significant. So this also means that there's no real evidence for publication bias, which is very positive. And we also looked, that finding is unfortunately less positive. We also looked at the statistical power of the studies, once for intentions and once for behaviors. And here you can see, so the dark red area is power between 0 and 10%. The dark orange area, for example, is power between 10 and 20%, etc. And here you can see that, especially for behaviors, all effect sizes are in the dark red area, so 0 to 10% power. So from these plots, you can see that all studies included were highly underpowered to detect such small effect sizes. Okay, and now I would like to end the presentation with some recommendations, first for policymakers, so a little bit more applied recommendations, and then for researchers who want to study spillover effects. So in general, for policymakers, we would recommend to choose interventions based on their expected direct effects, because as we've seen, most likely spillover effects are either not there or they're simply extremely small. So for now, it may be best to focus on the expected direct effect. However, if people still want to aim for positive spillover effects, we would recommend autonomy supportive interventions, so kind of interventions that leave people the choice whether they want to engage in the behavior or not. So for example, things like education and information. We would also recommend to provide a rationale why people should engage in the first behavior, especially when you aim for a spillover on behaviors. And as we've seen earlier, also normative goals seem to be associated with the most positive spillover effects. So appealing to environmental protection rather than personal gain goals. And lastly, we would recommend if people aim for positive spillover that they don't use any financial disincentives or incentives, especially when aiming for spillover on intentions. And for researchers, on the one hand, we want to emphasize that they should be aware of generalizability, especially for student samples. We've seen that in student samples, the effect actually seem to be more negative than in community or the general population samples. We would also like to emphasize to do research like a PRO, which stands for Power Reporting and Open Science. So as we've seen, the statistical power was super low in most of, or actually all the studies. So we kind of created some guidelines on how people could increase the power. And one of the recommendations is also big team science there, because you need a large sample for that. And most of those samples can actually only be achieved if people work together. We also, I won't go into detail here, but we also provide researchers with some reporting guidelines and a reporting template on which, statistics, but also general information should be reported in spillover research. And then lastly, we also, open science is not that common in that field of research yet, so we also strongly encourage open science practices, especially the open materials, because a few studies actually used quite the same, or used the same procedure, but then very different materials. So that could actually save researchers a lot of time if others made their materials openly available. And lastly, because the field, so the oldest study that was included in this meta-analysis was actually from 2011. So it's not, it's a quite young field. So most likely a lot of studies will become available in the next years. And therefore we also encourage regular meta-analytic updates. And to facilitate that, we also provide open code and open data so that people could work with this to update this meta-analysis at some point. Yeah, and this way I would like to end my presentation. Many thanks for listening. And if you got curious about that line of research, you can check out our postprint. Many thanks.
Thank you so much, Sandra. I loved your slides, and seriously, the graph game in this presentation is exceptional. Like, I love the visualization. And I think we can open up the session to questions from our audience. So if you have any questions for Flavio or Sandra, please feel free to unmute and share, or you can drop it in the chat box.
I just want to say to Sandra that I hope her presentation will be made available soon, because I'm conducting one, and she has, I mean, she does every possible single analysis, and I'm really glad I don't have, I have that as to like how to best do one. So thank you. Will save us a lot of time.
Thank you.
Hi, I think I would like to compliment both the presenters because this is my first PSACON event that I'm attending, and I was super excited for it. And to be honest, coming from a Southeast Asian country where we're still exploring all of the things that you just said, starting from understanding how certain concepts in psychology per se are still not very culturally diverse, as well as, so I'm also involved in intervention studies, being a clinical psychologist myself, and developing, first understanding those concepts in the Asian perspective or a diverse perspective, plus using intervention at the same time just makes it more weirder, and we don't understand that there are limitations to it. But I think this spillover study that you are aiming at and the meta-analysis that you did gave me a lot of insight, and I think I would definitely reach out to you, for my own research, and just brainstorm with you sometime, if that's okay.
Thank you. Yeah, I was also actually thinking a lot, for example, about the sample size limitations. Like, so many studies use just 100 to 200 people, and I mean, with that, you can't even reliably detect direct effects. So I was also really wondering why people do that. But then I also thought, okay, it's not only the researchers' fault, but probably also in general, the structural fault that there's maybe not enough funding to, or maybe no funding at all to achieve those sample sizes. Yeah, so that was also just one very random thought. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was very impressed with the graphical representation, like Ashar already said, but the fact that in the 30% of the spillover effect that was found in one of your graphs, I still think that's a win-win situation, but because it's the 30% which is getting acknowledged. So I was still very happy that, hey, when people are not talking seriously about the spillover effect in the intervention module itself, that 30% makes a big difference. And I think it's still, that's a good job.
Okay, so I have a question for Flavio. I mean, I can't say that I understand a lot about measurement theory and its critiques, but as someone who recently was looking up questionnaires to understand how people feel about LGBTQ rights, I know that there's very little literature, and that is very common. So a lot of these scales talk about very, very different things. So in the end, I know that researchers, when they look at something like that, the resolve would be, okay, might as well just begin a new one and create a new one. And most of the time we look at psychometric tests of checking for validity, checking for reliability, but it never goes so far into, is the theory correct? And do I need to create a new one at all when this construct might have been looked at already? So my question is, when you come from the place of looking at ideology constructs from an operational definition, does it really change for when you look at something very specific, such as just LGBT rights as compared to all ideologies? And what would your recommendation be if somebody comes across a literature where there are a lot of scales? What steps would you recommend a researcher take before deciding to create a whole new scale?
So first of all, if you are looking at, say, Cronbus alpha, okay, that is a one line of code in R, right? You are already at the 25th quantile, that the best 25th, the third quantile of best research practices. So if you report one validity evidence, you are already top of your game. If you are able to tell me you did a factor analysis, And if you specify the extraction method, then you're like already at the 1% level. So we're not even talking about discriminant validity, or multi-method, multi-trait. No, we're talking about reporting things like, oh, this has 7 items. My scale has 7 items. Thank you. This is already very rare to find. People do not report the item text. People do not report how many items or any validity measure. So that is the current practice. So I would say that from the get-go, you are already taking a lot of steps towards the reproducibility of your scale by other people in other contexts. So this is important. The second thing is you can always dive deeper into a construct. So, oh, LGBT rights is just one aspect of it, of ideology, sure, but in of itself, it's very plural. And the more you learn and the more you read about theory and the more you understand all the social idiosyncrasies of that one issue, the race repercussions, what is the word Sandra was using? Spillover effects of identifying effects of identifying or having a close one next to you, etc. So in of itself, I can obviously see a scale that has 8 facets that tries to measure that one attitude, right? Because you're diving deeper. So what I would say is, whatever it is that you're measuring, do read on measurement development. So for example, Iko Fried's and Jessica Flake's work, for example, measurement, and Jessica has also another paper on this, on the practices of measurement in social psychology as well in 2018, I want to say, that is absurdly good, that has a guideline of how to go about each step. And this is a relatively low effort, but very high pay for the evolution of the topic you're studying, because it's not only you, right? It's the people that read your study and follow up on the knowledge that you brought in. So I think you're doing golden. So.
Thank you.
Did I answer the question?
Yes, definitely. These are some of the concerns that I've had, because I got into teaching psychometry in India just right out of reading psychometry, just for interest after my master's. So one of the biggest concern was, how am I going to tell someone not to choose to just start off making a scale when, you know, I have so much to learn. So this is, I feel like we just need more meta reflection about measurement theory. But yeah, all right. Does anyone else?
Just one more, just to say that it's not always bad to create your measure. So I should be more clear about this, right? So if you create one that is validated and that is open and everybody can see the items and the data is available, this is much better than relying on a scale that does not have any of these properties, right? So I don't mean to equate, oh, create one is bad, as long as we create better.
Yeah, inform the creation. Okay, I'm going to give somebody else a chance to ask questions.
Yeah, I actually had a general question to you, Flavio, or maybe also just to everyone. So if we kind of, I see that in quite a lot of fields and with quite a lot of constructs, that there are a lot of different measures. Like even in environmental psychology, it's a relatively new field. There are already like 20 measures for one construct. So once we kind of are aware of the problem, how would you go about developing a standardized one? Or maybe that's not even the next step. What would be the next step if you kind of identify, okay, this is a problem we have, we want to measure one construct, but actually have like so many different scales. Yeah, what do we do?
I'll give it a shot then. All right, so the goal is, so in political science and sociology, different than psychology, maybe because psychology is so diverse, but in political science and sociology, there are, it is very common to have institutions tied to governmental bodies that conduct research, like in clinical psychology as well, right? I have less knowledge about clinical psychology, but so I'm just guessing here, but that are conducted yearly or annually, that survey the people, it's public on several issues. So there's the General Social Survey, there is American National Election Study, there is the European Social Value Survey, there is the European Social Survey, and so on, and Eurobarometer, Latin American Barometer. So we do have some institutions that could take care of that could help us in that effort. Now, I do want to mention that I believe ESS does do this. So for every scale that they put into their I don't know if but I've seen several interesting psychometric evidence for the measurements that are there. So ESS really does have methodologists, and they put their methodology in practice, and these reports are online in its website. So standardized measures are like this in a way, right? So it is there, it's used in time, and it's improved upon time. Now, does that mean that this is the gold standard? No. But what if this measure happens to be invariant across time? Would it be better to be invariant across race, invariance across countries? Sure. But maybe if my study design investigates invariance across time, I can use that scale, or I should be able to use that scale. So obviously there isn't a way to do just, well, maybe there is. I'm highly skeptical, but maybe there is a way to do everything. But just knowing the properties in of itself would be, in comparison to what we have right now, would be enough.
Yeah,